If you believe modern life is safe and predictable, it is because you have forgotten that just over 1,000 years ago, the silence of a calm morning could be broken by ships coming from the north, carrying men who asked for nothing, only took everything. Before continuing, if you enjoy stories that reveal the hidden side of history, the human mind, and our forgotten past, subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to hear will change the way you see the modern world. And the strangest part is that all of this begins not with an empire, but with the climate. In a frozen region called Scandinavia, where winter was not just a season but a force that decided who survived and who disappeared, the so-called Vikings were born. They were not monsters, as many stories make them seem. They were farmers, fishermen, family men. But the environment they lived in left no room for weakness. When the land did not produce enough and the cold lasted longer than the food, survival stopped being a choice and became a direction. And here comes the first reality shock. The Vikings did not leave home to conquer the world out of initial ambition, but out of necessity. Scarcity shaped their courage. And this changes everything you think you know about violence in human history, because often it is not the desire to dominate that creates conquerors, but the lack of alternatives. Over time, these communities learned to look beyond the horizon. And that is when one of the greatest weapons of the ancient world emerged: the longship. It was not just a vessel. It was an extension of the Viking body itself. Light, fast, capable of crossing rivers and open seas, it allowed something the European world of the time was not prepared to face: unexpected, rapid, and precise attacks. Imagine living in a coastal village where peace seems constant, and within a few hours everything you know disappears in smoke. That is what happened in regions of what is now England. But there is an important detail that almost no one notices. The Vikings did not have organized armies like the empires they faced. There was no centralized structure at the beginning. What existed was something more primitive and at the same time more flexible. Small, highly adaptable groups. And this created a huge psychological advantage. While European kingdoms relied on time, hierarchy, and slow communication, the Vikings relied on quick decision-making and collective instinct. And here comes a fundamental shift in understanding this story. Modern archaeological excavations have found not only weapons and ships, but also settlement patterns and trade routes that reveal something surprising. The Vikings were not just raiders. They were also traders, explorers, and in many cases colonizers who sought to settle. This discovery completely changes the traditional image of the barbarian destroyer. Records found in ancient chronicles such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, combined with evidence from burials and carbon-dated artifacts, show a complex network of exchanges, contacts, and even cultural integration. In other words, the Viking world was far more sophisticated than the myth suggests. But why, then, did they become known mainly for violence? The answer lies in the way history is recorded. For those who were attacked, the impact was immediate and traumatic. For outside observers, it looked like pure chaos. But for those living within that culture, it was survival on a collective scale. Here, human behavior is revealed. The same action can be seen as terror or strategy, depending on who tells the story. As their expeditions expanded, the Vikings went far beyond what any European thought possible. They reached distant lands, established routes as far as the Mediterranean, and even interacted with Eastern cultures. Some groups even formed long-lasting settlements, mixing with local populations. This means that, contrary to the image of fleeting invaders, they also helped build new societies. But there is something even deeper in this story. The Vikings had a worldview based on fate and courage in the face of the inevitable. For them, there was no guarantee of eternal safety. A person's value was measured by how they faced the unknown, not by the protection they accumulated. And this creates a direct contrast with modern society, where we increasingly seek control, predictability, and comfort. Think about it for a moment. Today, many of us avoid small risks, while those men crossed unknown oceans in wooden ships, guided only by stars and experience. This does not mean they were superior, but that they lived under completely different rules of survival. And here comes another fascinating point. The Viking expansion was also driven by the social networks of the time, only not digital but human ones. Stories of wealth, fertile lands, and success traveled faster than the ships themselves. A group would return with silver, land, or prestige, and that acted as living propaganda. Others wanted to follow the same path. Thus, expansion was not only military, it was also psychological. Over time, however, the world began to change. European kingdoms became better organized, built stronger defenses, and formed alliances. Surprise attacks started to lose their effectiveness. In addition, many Vikings began to integrate into local societies, adopting new languages, customs, and religions. What began as an era of expansion slowly turned into assimilation. But perhaps the most interesting part of this story is not its rise or decline, but what it reveals about us. Because the Vikings were not an exception to humanity. They were an extreme mirror of something that still exists today: the human capacity to adapt to the environment, transform hardship into strategy, and use the unknown as a driving force. And when you observe this carefully, you realize that the past is not as distant as it seems. The decisions, fears, and impulses that drove those warriors are still present within us, only in different forms. Today, we do not face frozen seas in wooden ships, but we still respond to fear, scarcity, and the search for meaning in the same way. In the end, the Viking Age is not just a story of conquests. It is a story about how the environment can completely shape human behavior, transforming ordinary people into explorers, traders, or warriors. And also about how the image we have of the past is almost never complete, but rather a version filtered through the fear and perspective of those who recorded the events. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this: what we call civilization is only a thin layer over very ancient instincts. And when that layer breaks, human beings are still capable of things as creative as they are destructive, exactly as they were 1,000 years ago, when ships from the north appeared on the horizon and changed everything within hours.